The sound of water is not a gentle splash. It is a heavy, rhythmic, bone-shattering thud against the iron hull, growing louder, faster, and more insistent with every passing heartbeat as the pressure builds. You are lying flat on your back in absolute pitch-black darkness, where the air tastes thickly of stale, stagnant oil, sulfur, and your own trapped, ragged breath that refuses to circulate. Outside, across the gleaming waters of the tropical paradise, the world is ending in fire, deafening thunder, and the desperate screams of a massive fleet caught entirely unaware on a sleepy morning. But you are miles away from the surface, buried alive deep inside a sinking steel tomb that has rolled over on its side like a mortally wounded animal gasping for its final moments. You are a trained radio operator, and your absolute final duty to your country was to tap out a frantic distress signal into the ether before the power cable snapped. Now, you are nothing more than a desperate human ear pressed desperately against cold, vibrating metal, listening as the thunderous explosions above slowly die down, only to be replaced by the most terrifying, indifferent silence of the deep ocean floor. This is not the grand, romanticized history of generals, admirals, and sweeping naval fleets. This is the claustrophobic, suffocating reality of a young man watching his entire world vanish into the darkness, knowing with absolute certainty that the sun will rise on a world that has already forgotten he exists down here in the mud. If you are deeply drawn to the hidden truths that time tried so desperately to erase, to the quiet scars left on the paper pages of those who were never given a voice in the official records, consider subscribing to the War Diaries. Today, we are opening the shattered, water-damaged logs of a young sailor who never made it back to the shore to tell his story. We are leaving far behind the sweeping, cinematic shots of high-altitude bombing runs and the grand, distant political narratives of the Pacific War to crawl directly into the cramped, oil-slicked darkness of a capsized battleship resting at the bottom of Pearl Harbor. This is the harrowing story of the isolated, the forgotten, and the ultimate psychological toll of being forced to witness the terrifying sunrise of a brand new, much darker era of human conflict from inside a coffin of steel. We are about to step into a closed space where normal time completely stops. Oxygen becomes a luxury currency, and only the echoing sound of your own accelerating heartbeat remains to keep you company in the abyss. The quiet Sunday morning before the storm. On the idyllic morning of December 7th, 1941, the opening diary entries begin with the mundane, almost heartbreakingly peaceful observations of a routine Sunday in Hawaii. The entries describe the blinding, tropical brightness of the Pacific sun dancing across the waves, the crisp taste of salt spray lingering on the gentle morning breeze, and the casual, light-hearted chatter of young sailors dreaming of their upcoming shore leave hours later that afternoon. It was a day designed by nature for total tranquility. The low fidelity, comforting music drifting from the ship's communal gramophone, and the rich, warm smell of breakfast frying in the galley created an absolute, unshakable, false sense of permanence. The young operator writes down his simple, innocent plans in his notebook to finally finish reading a dog-eared adventure book, the letters he desperately meant to write and send home to his anxious mother back in the Midwest, and the profound, almost hypnotic beauty of the harbor itself, where the massive battleships of the Pacific Fleet sat in calm, orderly, majestic lines like silent steel sentinels guarding a peace that everyone on board believed was entirely unbreakable. We must pause right here to consider the agonizing fragility of such peace. In the long, brutal annals of wartime history, few moments are quite as jarring as the sudden, violent collapse of a calm Sunday morning into an absolute inferno. The diary records this terrifying transition with a sickening, creeping sense of inescapable doom. As the clock on the bulkhead approached 8 in the morning, the peaceful routine was abruptly shattered by a low, vibrating hum that no one on the deck quite recognized as an immediate threat until the first massive, cataclysmic explosion rippled directly through the water, shattering the morning stillness into a million jagged pieces. This was not a formal military engagement or a scheduled drill. It was a total, vicious disruption of reality itself. The author notes the sudden, violent shift in the chemistry of the air, the sharp, chemical smell of ozone, the visceral, bone-shaking vibration of the entire deck as the first torpedoes struck the helpless side of the USS Oklahoma, and the chaotic, frantic rush of heavy boots pounding on the steel above that told them everything they had ever been trained for was about to be put to the ultimate, horrific test. The transition from a quiet morning to the absolute brink of annihilation took less time than it takes to read a single sentence, and the world they knew vanished into fire and black smoke before they even had time to realize they were under attack. The world flips upside down. The catastrophic impact on the USS Oklahoma, where our young radio operator was stationed, was not a singular event. It was a complete, structural collapse of his entire physical reality. The diary describes the sickening sensation of the world literally turning over on its axis as the massive ship took torpedo hit after hit along its flank. It began to list violently to port, the crushing weight of thousands of tons of seawater rushing uncontrollably into the lower decks, pulling it down with a terrifying, inexorable speed. Objects that had always been safely anchored to the floorboards, heavy tools, personal footlockers, framed photographs of sweethearts, and iron bunks, suddenly became lethal, uncontrolled projectiles, sliding and smashing violently against the bulkheads as the vessel rolled completely onto its side. Our narrator writes of the frantic, adrenaline-fueled scramble to reach his post in the radio room, a desperate, sliding climb through a dark labyrinth of twisted steel beams and rising floodwater that felt increasingly like a losing battle against the laws of physics itself. The crushing claustrophobia sets in right here, becoming a living character of its own within the narrative. The diary records the agonizing moments where the ship finally settled heavily into the thick harbor mud, trapping hundreds of terrified men inside a pressurized, airtight metallic shell. In the total absence of sunlight, time loses all its meaning, stretching seconds into endless hours. The author describes the haunting sounds of the men huddled around him, their shallow, trembling breathing, their soft, whimpering prayers whispered into the dark, and the desperate, rhythmic, metallic tapping of men trapped in adjacent compartments, trying to communicate through the thick steel walls. Every single movement required careful, agonizing consideration. A single stray spark from a loose electrical wire could instantly ignite the leaking aviation fuel and cordite, turning their dark tomb into an instantaneous furnace. The diary captures the terrifying realization that they were no longer soldiers participating in a glorious war. they were helpless objects trapped inside a steel container, abandoned by the sudden, violent shift in the world's gravity. The ship had become an inescapable prison, and the ocean outside was the final, locked door that kept them away from the life-giving air. The slow decay of hope in the dark. As the seemingly endless hours dragged on into the afternoon and evening, the diary entries become increasingly sparse, characterized by the desperate, clawing need for fresh oxygen. The air trapped within the compartment was rapidly deteriorating, turning into a toxic, thick soup of rising carbon dioxide and heavy fuel vapors. The author writes of the heavy head and the dull, throbbing rhythm pounding relentlessly behind his eyes, the classic, agonizing medical symptoms of acute hypoxia. He speaks of watching the other men huddled near the darkened radio station, their faces completely obscured by the deep shadows, their voices dropping into exhausted whispers as their physical and mental strength rapidly failed them. The diary is no longer about the naval attack happening above. It is about the agonizingly slow, unyielding decline of the human spirit in the face of total environmental collapse. We need to pause here to consider the immense psychological weight of such extreme confinement. When you are buried alive beneath the surface of the sea, the human mind begins to play cruel, vivid tricks. The author records detailed, almost hallucinated memories of his peaceful home far away, the distinct smell of summer rain hitting hot pavement, the sound of his younger sister laughing in the backyard, the cold, refreshing taste of water from a garden hose, things that seem so impossibly far removed from the cold, oily reality of his current existence. These memories are not comforting. They are brutal, sharp reminders of everything that is slipping away from him. The diary records the desperate, lingering hope that someone above is hearing their frantic tapping, that a rescue party is out there burning through the thick steel hull. But as the hours stretch relentlessly into a full day, the tapping in the neighboring compartments begins to grow weaker, then erratic, and finally, heartbreakingly silent. The narrator is forced to confront the horrifying truth that they are not being rescued at all. They are simply waiting for the air to run out, one painful breath at a time. The slow decay of hope in the dark is far more painful than the initial shock of the attack ever was. The sound of the world above. One of the most haunting and psychologically devastating sections of the entire diary is the documentation of the muffled noises filtering down from the surface world. Because the massive ship was resting entirely on its side, the steel hull acted like a giant acoustic resonator, amplifying every sound from the outside. The author writes about hearing the distant, muffled roar of the continuing attack, the dull, rolling thumps of secondary bombs, the high-pitched drone of aircraft engines passing overhead, and the sporadic, frantic chatter of anti-aircraft gunfire from the harbor defenses. It is a surreal, maddening experience to read these accounts. The world above is in a state of total, catastrophic war and panic, while inside the tomb, the air is deathly still, thick, and getting colder by the minute. The diary records the author's desperate, futile attempt to keep his radio equipment powered, hoping, perhaps, that a final signal might still magically penetrate the water, even if he himself could never escape. He describes the profound sense of utter detachment from the fighting taking place above. He could clearly hear the rescue teams working frantically on the outer hull, the metallic clang of heavy wrenches against steel, and the roaring vibration of pneumatic drills. But the heartbreaking truth was that they were working on the completely wrong sections of the ship, entirely misled by the chaotic, upside-down state of the vessel. Every single clang of a tool against the hull was a sudden, blinding jolt of hope that was immediately followed by the crushing, absolute despair of hearing the sound move away, leaving them stranded in the same suffocating dark. The diary captures the quiet anger and resentment that began to fester inside him, not towards the enemy pilots, but towards the bureaucracy, the command system, and the sheer, brutal bad luck of being assigned to the wrong compartment at the wrong hour. The author writes of his final attempts to scratch a farewell message into the wooden casing of the radio cabinet, leaving a legacy for a family that might never find his remains, documenting the unfairness of dying in the dark while the sun was shining brightly on a world that had already moved on without them. The final shift of the tide. As the second night falls over the harbor, the diary entries transform completely from coherent thoughts into fractured, delirious musings. The freezing cold of the Pacific has finally permeated the thick steel hull, and the narrator describes the profound, frightening, numbing sensation spreading through his limbs, the way white frost is beginning to collect on the overhead pipes above his head. He writes about the flickering of the end, a psychological state of exhaustion so absolute that his mind is no longer afraid of dying, but instead feels a strange, unnatural, euphoric peace. He documents the last few words spoken by his remaining companions, simple, quiet goodbyes to wives and children whose faces he can barely recall anymore in the pitch black. The diary is no longer a tool of survival or communication. It is a final act of witness, a solemn testament carved into paper proving that they existed. He notes that the water level inside the compartment has finally stopped rising, but the air has become so perilously thin that even drawing a light breath is an immense, painful muscular effort. He mentions the silence once more, that terrifying, absolute silence that now defines his entire existence. The diary captures the final transition from being a living man to becoming merely a part of the lifeless wreckage. He writes about the ship as if it were a living creature, a giant that is tired of holding its breath against the weight of the sea and is finally ready to sink deep into the silent silt of the harbor floor. There is a sense of cosmic, unyielding inevitability in the words, a total resignation to the fact that he was never meant to leave this metal box alive. The final entry in the book is just a shaky, unfinished sentence, trailing off into a messy, erratic line of graphite that suggests the pen simply slipped from his frozen, tired fingers forever. The harbor floor ultimately claimed the USS Oklahoma and its entire trapped crew, and with them, the fragile voice of a young radio operator whose final days were defined not by the glory of combat, but by the quiet, brutal intimacy of a slow, unseen end. For many years, the true story of the men trapped alive inside the capsized hull was a closely guarded military secret, a dark and tragic chapter in the Pearl Harbor narrative that the command preferred to leave buried deep in the mud. But the discovery of these recovered fragments, the damaged radio components, and the scrawled, desperate notes left behind reminds us permanently that history is never just about the big picture, the fleets, and the maps. It is about the millions of small, unseen human tragedies that occur quietly in the shadow of the giants. History is not just written in books. It is carved into the walls of the tombs we leave behind. If you felt the profound, crushing weight of this journey, Leave a comment below, sharing your thoughts, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next dark archive we unlock from the past. Until the next diary.